Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Column EDC Coffee Chat this morning. We really appreciate it, and we are very honored today to have Congressman Kilmer join us. There's, of course, been a lot going on in DC, and I think a lot of opportunities for our communities with the ongoing funding for infrastructure and science and the economy and all sorts of things. So with that, I really, once again, we are very honored to have Congressman Kilmer join us, and I'm going to let him take it away. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Colleen, and thanks to the EDC. I think many of you know before I got to Congress, I worked for the Column EDC's sister organization in Pierce County, and I just think the work that economic development.
That? Is it too loud?
Sorry.
It's okay for me.
There we go.
I wasn't the only one that heard that, right?
Yeah, correct.
All right. All right. I'm going to keep saying nice things about Colleen and Lori, but I really appreciate the work that they do, and particularly during the last few years that have been really challenging. It's been really terrific to see the EDC step up in all the ways that it has. Let me just give a little bit of rear view mirror and then a bit of windshield, and then take whatever questions you've got. I think it's worth noting that, when 2021 kicked off, things looked pretty bleak. At that point, nobody had been vaccinated. Our kids were all in virtual school, which as a parent, I can tell you was really the pits. There was real concerns about the impact of this pandemic on our Main Street employers. We were seeing record lines at our food banks and record housing insecurity. And it's why Congress very early in 2021 passed that American Rescue Plan, which got shots into arms and now means that the virus isn't controlling our lives in the way that it had previously. It provided a lot of assistance to Main Street employers so that we could avert a depression. And the upshot of that has been that we have the lowest unemployment rate in 5 decades, which is, I think, good news. There was a lot of support provided to local communities to just manage some of the stress and strain, both from a public health standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. I was in Port Angeles and Sequim last week with the county commissioners and got to talk about things like the lifeboat program, which was funded out of American Rescue Plan dollars. We looked at some of the projects related to water infrastructure and broadband and food security that were able to be funded out of those American Rescue Plan dollars that were allocated by the county. So that was good news. I think that provided a lot of benefit. Soon thereafter, Congress passed the infrastructure law. The headline of that was that it was the most substantial investment in roads and bridges since the creation of the interstate highway system. But it wasn't just that, it was also water, drinking water, stormwater, wastewater, broadband infrastructure. It also included some things that haven't gotten a lot of press attention. There's funding to address flooding. And as we've dealt with some of these king tides recently, providing that support to coastal communities, I think could be a really big deal going forward. I led the charge in the House. Senator Cantwell led the charge in the Senate on a new program focused on culverts, the replacement of and removal of culverts, so that we can address some of these issues on fish passage. Our state is on the hook to do that, and having the federal government step up and provide some help rather than that cost being borne solely by the taxpayers of Washington state, I think is really good news. Then there was a focus on addressing 2 problems that the pandemic had presented, one being inflation and the other being supply chain disruption. And those 2 problems were very closely interrelated. You've seen disruption of supply chain mean that we had shortages, and based on Econ 101, supply and demand, when you have a supply shortage, costs go up. Many of you have been to a car dealership over the course of the last couple of years will notice that there's something missing at a lot of them. Cars, and that's in part because of a shortage of semiconductors in this country. The United States invented the semiconductor, invented the chip, but we only manufacture about 10% of them here in America. And that's why Congress went to work and passed the CHIPS and Science Act. It was a bipartisan bill that really focused on addressing some of those shortages and trying to bring back those manufacturing jobs to the United States so that we're not dependent on other countries for those critical goods. there was an important piece of that law, and I know Colleen and the team at the EDC are all over this, but I led the charge on a new pilot program in that new law called the RECOMPETE Act. And it's focused on providing some flexible, long-term support to communities that have faced persistent economic distress so that there can be economic opportunity no matter what zip code you live in. In the spending bill that passed at the end of last year, we actually secured $200 million for this fiscal year so that the Economic Development Administration can get cooking on providing that assistance to communities. I share this in part because I want you to get ready, because the Economic Development Administration is currently finalizing a request for information from stakeholders. They're going to be looking for input about how they set the rules of the road on this. And I know in talking to Colleen, the EDC has some opinions about how that program should be implemented. And so we'll make sure that you have information about that. And I do hope that this group will respond to the RFI. On top of that, the Economic Development Administration is intending to host some listening sessions around the country. I have asked them to have a listening session in our neck of the woods. And I think, both of these are designed to get EDA information from folks on the ground who will apply for these RECOMPETE grants on how to set up the application process, how to set up the program in a way that works for communities, and hopefully makes this user-friendly and makes it something that can be successful for communities that just need a bit of a hand. The application is also expected to launch in the first half of 2023 as well, following the request for information and the listening sessions. And so starting to think through, okay, if we were going to apply for this, how would we use flexible long-term support to close the employment gap, the prime age employment gap in our area? I think is really important. And I'm more than happy, I'm enthusiastic about being a thought partner to Clallam County, to the EDC, to the North Olympic Development Council, as we kind of think through how to pursue that funding. I mentioned Congress acted on two things. One was this issue of supply chain, which was the CHIPS and Science Act, which included that RECOMPETE program. The other was the Inflation Reduction Act, which the president signed into law. That was really focused on just trying to give folks a break. It was predominantly focused on lowering healthcare costs, lowering healthcare premiums, lowering some of the costs seniors were facing, particularly with regard to prescription drugs, allowing Medicare for the first time to negotiate for lower drug prices. That is a huge winner, not just for seniors as they grapple with the costs of prescriptions, but also for taxpayers. This is a law that substantially reduces the deficit to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, in part because of the ability to negotiate for lower drug prices. The other piece of this was trying to lower our energy costs for consumers and for businesses, providing tax credits and investments to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, to take action in the face of the climate crisis, but also to create more economic opportunity around industries that we know are going to be a big part of our future. There's some other things that passed that are now getting implemented. The Honoring Our Pact Act was a law that was really focused on helping veterans that have been exposed to toxic substances in their service. I represent a whole lot of folks who unfortunately are in that boat, who were often given the runaround as they sought the care and the benefits that they'd earned in service to our country. Thankfully, that bipartisan bill passed, the Honoring Our Pact Act, which creates a presumption that if you developed health problems after having been exposed to toxic substances in service to our country, it creates a presumption that those health problems were caused by exposure to toxic substances, and make sure that people can get the health care and the benefits that they've earned. Beyond that, at the end of last year, Congress passed a bipartisan spending law that met a lot of important needs for our region, housing being a very substantial one, some additional funding around mental health and substance abuse services, which is a big priority for the region I represent. It also included some funding for local projects, including the Joint Emergency Operations Center, which was a big priority for the county and the city, and for local law enforcement. Healthcare facilities in Port Angeles and in Neah Bay, to help the Lower Elwha tribe with its healthcare campus, just there off of 101, and to help Neah Bay, to help the Makah tribe move its health clinic out of the tsunami zone and up to higher ground. We also were able to secure some funding for affordable housing development in Port Townsend, and for sewer capacity in Port Hadlock, which is not just a sewer project, it's also a housing project. We visited a empty plot of land that without sewer can help build 4 housing units, and with sewer can build 220. So that's a game changer as we look at this infrastructure law, as we look at some of these investments. Being able to address some of the pain points in our region is a big deal. I guess the final thing I'll say is, a big part of my focus is not just trying to have an economy that works better for folks, but also trying to have a government that works better for people too. For the last 4 years, I've led a committee in Congress called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which makes us sound like the IT help desk. But we were nicknamed the Fix Congress Committee. And our charge, our mission was simply put to propose reforms to make Congress work better for the American people. Most of the time, if you look at about every 20 or 30 years or so, Congress creates these committees, and mostly they do squat. Mostly they don't accomplish anything or pass any recommendations. Our committee, thankfully, without much fanfare, was pretty unique. We passed 202 bipartisan recommendations focused on making Congress work better. 45 have already been implemented. There's about 70 more that are in process of being implemented. And a new subcommittee was created under the new majority, under House administration, to focus on implementation of the rest of the recommendations. So I think that's really good news as we try to have a Congress that is more functional, that's more efficient, that's more transparent, and that works better for you. I also co-chair a group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group. It's, I was going to say a dozen Democrats and Republicans, now 14 Democrats and 14 Republicans that are focused on just trying to find common ground where we can. We've been able to actually make some progress. In fact, at the end of last year, we passed a government reform bill to do something when we get audits from the Government Accountability Office, when we get recommendations from the Government Accountability Office about how to save money, to make sure that there's action on those. That law came out of the bipartisan working group and is expected to save literally tens of billions of taxpayer dollars. And so it just gives you a sense of what happens when Democrats and Republicans actually try to work together to make people's lives better and to actually solve problems rather than just focusing on partisan bickering. Final thing I want to say is just kind of a public service announcement. I'm joined on the Zoom by Haley from my team. She's our feet on the street in Clallam and Jefferson counties. Half of our team is caseworkers, where if someone has an issue with any federal agency, we go to work on their behalf. Over the last few years, it's been a lot of folks having issues with the Small Business Administration or with the IRS. Most commonly in our district, it's with the VA. Lately, it's been folks who are traveling for the first time in a long time and didn't realize they had an expired passport. Turns out we can even help with that. And I share this with you because I know many of you on the Zoom. If you or someone you know has an issue with any federal agency, please reach out to our office. We are more than happy to help. So, and Haley just put her contact information into the chat. With that, I'll stop talking. I'm eager to hear what's on your minds, answer whatever questions, hear whatever concerns, take whatever suggestions you've got.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk more about the RECOMPETE Act, and it seems like such a huge opportunity for our communities. And maybe you could expand a little bit more about that regarding how I've read a lot of the literature on it, and even the Brookings Institute document, but it still is not really clear as far as, like, I know it's supposed to be increasing the amount of high-paying jobs for 25 to 54-year-olds. However, is there a threshold of increase for jobs and number of jobs and the amount that those jobs are paid in order to qualify?
So let me start with kind of the 3 problems we were trying to solve through this new law. One is an acknowledgement that communities that have faced persistent economic distress, by and large, do not have an army of grant writers and are able to navigate a complex system of federal grants and loans. Mm-hmm. Second is that most communities that face persistent economic distress haven't developed those challenges in a year and probably are not going to get out of those challenges in a year. And third is an acknowledgement that different communities have different challenges, that a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work. You know, even if you look at the district I represent, the challenges in PA or in Sequim are different than the challenges in Aberdeen and Hoquiam, right? Like Aberdeen and Hoquiam, the biggest problem is 90% of the landmass is in the floodplain, right? So their capacity to drive new housing development, new economic development is really hindered by that. So if they could get some help, they'd probably use it to address the flooding issue. You know, there's communities that I represent where the biggest issue is lack of sewer. There's communities I represent where it's lack of broadband access. For some areas, it's workforce issues where they need training programs. Some areas need more assistance to small businesses because they just, both from a lending standpoint, from an advising standpoint. So there's just an acknowledgement that different communities have different needs. So how does this law address this? Well, one, recognizing that distressed communities don't have an army of grant writers, it sets up a bunch of technical assistance through the Economic Development Administration. In fact, the way the pilot program works is initially there's going to be planning grants provided by the Economic Development Administration to basically support the needs of local communities to figure out, okay, if we could get some flexible long-term support, what would we do with it? How would we close this, as you put it, as you pointed out? What the problem we're trying to solve for is closing the prime age employment gap, where there are communities, you know, one of the measures of economic stress is how many folks between age 25 and 54 are employed rather than not employed. And so this, the support being provided is aimed to try to bridge that gap. Again, acknowledging that it may be a different answer in Clallam County than it is in Grays Harbor County or in Mason County, where I was yesterday. Second, it's long-term support. So it's 5 years worth of grants. Because, you know, a one-off grant is helpful, but it's generally not enough to help sort of turn a ship. And so providing some longer term support is really what this new law is about. And then third, it's flexible, right? So it says, in essence, a community has to make the case for how these investments will close the prime age employment gap, but it'll be flexible. If, you know, if it's a basic infrastructure need, if it's a workforce need, the community will be able to use the resources to meet whatever challenge they have with the goal of closing the prime age employment gap. Beyond that, the Economic Development Administration is part of the reason they're doing this request for information and doing these listening sessions is that they want to make sure it works for communities on the ground. So for example, Colleen, you and I've talked about this already. And I've already communicated this to the head of the Economic Development Administration. It doesn't make sense if the goal is to help distressed communities to provide a very substantial matching requirement where the community would be on the hook for a whole bunch of money to be able to match federal funds. That defeats the purpose, right? Like if you had a bunch of money to provide for a match, you probably wouldn't need the help from the federal government in the first place, right? There are those sorts of issues that we're trying to tee up for the EDA. And so it's worth thinking about, not just Colleen, but everybody on the line, you know, when we do this listening session, are there particularly messages that you want to convey to EDA about how we can ensure that it works for you? Because I think they want to be, they're pretty open-minded and they haven't, you know, written the rules in stone tablets, right? They're doing the request for information and they're doing these listening sessions for a reason.
Well, that's good news. Our state has what's called a ICAP launch, the Innovation Cluster Acceleration Program launch. And we met with the state reps yesterday, Dr. Underwood and I did, to talk about specifically how could Clallam County use that program to help us prepare for the RECOMPETE Act. And it's only $50,000, but they're going to be coming out to our county either March 15th or 16th and talking to us in person. So I invite everyone here to join if they want to, you know, talk about this. Really, I'm going to use that program as the intention is to try to move this forward and apply for the 50,000 so that someone can be working, so we can hire someone to help us prepare for the recompete and bring in community members that have opinions and get ideas so that it can be a really well-written document. I do, again, if we are going to change our economy, we need to do have a focus and work on innovative things that mean that we change our current trajectory, which, as I see it, well, if we keep on doing the same thing, we're going to have more retirees, more remote workers, more tourism, which is great in a lot of ways, but that doesn't change for 25 to 54-year-olds, or even people that aren't in their prime age. Thank you, I'm 55. That don't have a career that would pay more than $35,000 a year. And so, if we are able to get more housing, yes, that should lower our total costs, but we're a great place to live. And we keep on having this influx of people that is just raising the costs of housing for our workers. And our focus at the EDC is very singularly about the welfare of our workforce. So I'm excited about this process, but we need to figure out, it's great that we would have some funding, but what are those, maybe a couple different industry sectors that we pursue that would really have an innovative change, so we have more jobs at $75,000 a year. And that's what our analysis shows, that's what it takes in Clallam County for someone to be able to have some retirement and have the ability to afford housing here. Is for a single person, $75,000 a year. For two people and a child, it's $115,000 a year. So and that's of course with both people working. So it's not an easy uphill push, and typically recruiting a big, huge company isn't the way to do it. We've got to figure out, how do we have a competitive edge that will help change the trajectory of our economy. So I see Councilmember Lindsay has his hand up. Would you like to ask your question, Lindsay?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Representative Kilmer, for joining us, and Colleen, thanks for organizing and making us with EDC. I'm curious about solving for the workforce gap, and I think because so much of the housing shortage and housing crisis, skilled construction trades, like reinvigorating blue collar work. And those are jobs that often do pay the level that Colleen just described. There's just an article in the Seattle Times about a plumber who makes $140,000 in that area. But in my research on what is happening with the labor shortage in the U.S., which is something like 11 million to 13 million available jobs, like lack of workers throughout the United States, is a combination of three things. People retiring, and a lot of people accelerated their retirement or decided to finish their retirement after prolonging it after the Great Recession. That's about a third of that. And then the other third is lack of childcare. And a lot of people, particularly women, staying home because they can't afford childcare, or it doesn't pencil out based on the jobs available. And then the third is lack of immigrants, that due to our government's policies and our rhetoric, we have not seen the number of immigrants coming to the United States to really flush out our workforce. And we're also dealing with a very prolonged demographic shift, where the ratio of working people to non-working people is shifting. Bubble retires at a greater rate. And so all of those things really, I think, drive how we're And I'm curious more like what the EDC is thinking about that and what Representative Kilmer's office is thinking about that. Thank you.
I think you hit on a lot of the problem statement. In terms of things that have contributed to the workforce challenge, you're right. A lot of it has been folks who dropped out of the workforce or retired because of the pandemic. Childcare is a huge issue. You heard the president speak to this in the State of the Union. This is one of those things that ought not be a partisan issue, trying to address the fact that we have a massive childcare shortage in this country. I started my yesterday with the leadership of Joint Base Lewis McChord. It was the primary thing that they wanted to talk about. They just cannot find childcare for their personnel, which is an enormous problem and a huge strain on military families, but it's a strain on all families, and it's part of the reason you've seen a bunch of folks drop out of the workforce. For what it's worth, the House passed a very substantial childcare bill last year that unfortunately died on the beaches of the United States Senate, but I still think that's worth trying to move. There's been broad agreement within the business community and the labor community that more needs to be done with regard to immigration, not just on the high skills front, but on things like farm workforce. I think the fourth, and I've spent 10 years saying that one of the biggest failings of Congress, no matter who's in charge, one of the biggest failings of every president, no matter who's in charge, is the incapacity to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill. Hope springs eternal that will change, and I'm actively pushing to be part of the solution on that. But and the reality is there's agreement on probably about 90% of what a bipartisan immigration reform bill ought to look like. It's the 10% that keeps wrapping Congress around the axle, but that's dumb and we should fix that. I think the final dynamic that I would mention that you didn't mention is there are also a bunch of people who need jobs and a bunch of jobs that need people. And unfortunately, there's a skills mismatch. And so this is where things like career and tech ed programs the work done by our community and technical colleges can really be impactful in terms of helping someone get a industry certification, get retrained, so that we can get people into those jobs.
Great, thank you. Dale, you had a question, then I'll call on the people in the chat that have asked some questions.
Thank you. Representative Kilmer, I didn't quite catch it. Did you let people know that you were the person that introduced the RECOMPETE Act in Congress?
I'm not sure if I did, but thank you for saying it.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for getting yourself in the Washington Post around the work that you're doing with the Modernization Committee, as well as on Amanpour and Company. It's been very fun seeing a representative get such notice. My question is, thanks to the Economic Development Council, we've learned that Clallam County, we've learned just where the shortage of skilled workers are. They're in several key areas, and the Sequim School District is working on developing a new career technical education center so we can prepare youth for work in these 5 areas, or 5 of these areas. But because we're focusing on people that are younger than 25 years old, I'm wondering if this type of effort would be eligible for the RECOMPETE Act.
I don't think they've set the rules yet. I think it could likely be because, again, to some degree, we're playing the long game on this. How can communities be competitive and have economic opportunity over the long haul, right? Today's 18-year-old is going to be 25 soon enough. So, but I think, again, when they have a listening session, that's the type of thing that we ought to flag.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, let's see. Micah, I saw you had written a question in the chat.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Derek. And I really like how the RECOMPETE Act does give a lot of local control to the future, but it will take a while to ramp up. So I'm wondering if there's any centralized aspect to it, like the Civilian Conservation Corps in the Great Depression, because every town in our country has something that they still value built in the 20s.
Right. There's going to be a lot of flexibility to the local community. This is not an enormously top-down program. Now, having said that, the Economic Development Administration, as part of this, intends to provide very substantial technical assistance to communities to support their efforts to develop a plan and to implement a plan. Because remember, this is a pilot program, and they want it to be successful. And so the current plan is to probably pick 5 to 10 communities around the country. Part of the communication we've had with them is to make sure it's a sort of a diverse set of communities. So, maybe pick a couple largely timber areas in the Pacific Northwest, pick a mining town in West Virginia, or Kentucky, pick a manufacturing town, and sort of see if there's lessons learned by these pilots. So EDA will play a pretty active role in terms of administration of the program, but this is largely going to be a lot of flexibility to the community to use the resources as they see fit, with the goal of closing that prime age employment gap.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. And Mel Gildow, a small business owner that has a whole scrubbers business. Do you want to share your question, Mel?
Sure. Hi, Derek. Thanks for joining us today.
You bet.
So my question really is around a lot of the economic development funds available for businesses are really all focused on COVID timelines, which was 2020. January 2020 is the timeline on most of those. I registered my business in March of 2020. So none of that funding is even available to me as a small business. And most of the funding is geared towards nonprofits, research and development, which I'm not. I'm an enterprise business using products that have already been developed. So I'm trying to figure out if that's going to change anytime soon, so that small businesses that, yeah, I'm affected by COVID for sure. It took me 6 months to get a response back from Department of Ecology because people started working remotely, and now I've got additional delays upon additional delays. And really the only thing I've been able to do is get a small business international trade loan. And that was a challenge to get that, but clearly I'm qualified for small business development funding, but
Yeah.
Is any of that going to change?
So with regard to the pandemic specific programs, probably not. I mean, the Paycheck Protection Program has already been exhausted. So there's not, that pot is not getting refilled. The county has not spent all of its American Rescue Plan dollars. So that might be an avenue where in consultation with your county, with your EDC and your county commissioners, you might be able to pull something together that might support businesses like yours that started post-pandemic. But that'll be determined by the county. There's flexibility to the county and how it uses those resources. And I know a lot of those resources have gone to helping keep businesses afloat during this really challenging period. Beyond that, there are some existing SBA programs. In fact, at what time? At 11:30 today, we're having a workshop with the Small Business Administration on some of those programs, where we're going to have the director of the SBA's district office kind of walk through, here are some resources that are available. Mel, if you want to maybe just chat at Haley in the chat, we can get you the information. I don't think it's too late to sign up for that. But it may not be, I mean, I'm not sure if this workshop is going to be solve your problems, but we're more than happy to connect you with the SBA and see if there's other resources that may fit the bill for you.
Sure. And I've been working with John Brislin from the International Trade Group, and really what I guess more to the point of my question is, as new stuff comes out, will it still be focused on timelines based on the COVID responses? Because that's what
Probably
I've been
not.
seeing, and I've been
Yeah.
scratching my head saying, well, all right, that one doesn't apply to me. And how does that affect other small businesses also?
Yeah. No, I think the answer is probably not. I think we're, moving into a post-COVID era.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
You bet.
So I see we've got a couple of people on from the hospital on, but I've been hearing that our major hospital in our area, we've got a lot of great organizations from known the North Olympic Healthcare Network and Peninsula Behavioral Health. You got Jamestown Tribe, you've got Forks Hospital, that's a critical care hospital, but all these have different reimbursement rates. But our largest one that we all rely on, OMC, has really restrictive rates. So I see John turned his camera on. John, if you want to follow up, I think you know where I'm going with this. And one, pose your question to Representative Kilmer, but also make sure everybody understands the situation OMC is operating under and how much money you lost in 2016 because of it.
Good morning, Derek. First, I need to start with a thank you for your work on the site neutral situation. That is certainly key to us getting better. But as the largest economic driver, largest employer in the community, we are, as you are aware, we're not in good shape. Last year, we lost $16 million from operations. This is consistent with the rest of Washington State. We're waiting for fourth quarter statistics to come out. We figure hospitals in the state of Washington probably lost well north of $4 billion from operations last year. Mm-hmm. And it comes down to a very simple formula that, our reimbursements rising at, 3 to 4%, our expenses are rising at 10% as we pay higher costs for insurance, for utilities, for staffing. It's across the board. My concern as one of the leaders for our local medical center is we're not in a sustainable position, and I don't know how we're going to be. So I realize there's no silver bullet. You can't sit here and say this is going to be the answer, but I'm just curious kind of where this ranks in your, things that keep you up at night, because it certainly keeps me up at night.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. And I was born at OMC, so I care a lot about that hospital and the care that it provides. It's why we work so hard on that site neutral issue, because the impact of that rule that had been established was, to the tune of about $40 million loss to the hospital over 10 years. So having that repealed was a big deal for the hospital. I think there's two areas that we're trying to work this issue. One is on reimbursement. We're challenged particularly in rural areas because our payer mix is more focused on public payers, on Medicare and Medicaid, and those two systems reimburse lower than private pay, than employer-based healthcare, and even lower than the exchange. So, again, part of the focus needs to be, as we get more people employed, they'll have more employer-based insurance, and that ought to help the payer mix some. We also need to make sure that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services understands that in communities where the payer mix is predominantly public payers, that is not sustainable currently. And so that's something that we've invited the CMS administrator out to our region to have a listening session with the healthcare providers, just so they have a better sense of just the realities on the ground in rural America. The other piece of this is the cost side. And one of the biggest strains that we've seen is, this is basic supply demand. We don't have enough people working in healthcare right now. And some of that's been driven by the fact that it stunk to work in healthcare for the last few years during the pandemic. But ensuring that we're addressing from a workforce development standpoint, from the standpoint of having incentives so that providers, whether it be nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians, or folks up and down the kind of healthcare spectrum, are able to work in rural communities and get compensated in rural communities and maybe get some they're cost afraid for med school because they are willing to work in a rural community or in a provider shortage area. That makes a lot of sense and could dial down some of the cost pressure that OMC and others are facing. So there's some legislation that we've worked on in that regard, and we're going to continue to push on that.
Thank you.
Pat McCauley has a question in the chat. Pat, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I know we're all talking about Clallam County issues, but I travel a lot. So I seem to see that our infrastructure when it comes to the airports needs updating. And I've heard for years we need a new management system for the FAA. And I am just wondering if the infrastructure bill deals with that at all. It was so much money. I looked, oh, good, they need like $5 billion. Maybe some of that will go to the airports coming up with a new flight tracking plan or whatever. And with the recent railroad issues and port issues, I'm just wondering, I know we need better roads and we need to improve our roads, but I'm thinking there's a lot of other infrastructure that needs help too when it comes to transportation. And I mean, we have a transportation secretary who's probably busier than one has ever been for a long time with all the issues that keep popping up.
Yeah. So let me try to hit both of those issues. So there is funding in the infrastructure law for airports, small and large. But frankly, to address the issues you're talking about, the more likely scenario is one of the big bills that should be taken up over this next year is the reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration. So if the port has specific issues related to the FAA, and we've worked some of these issues already, but making sure that as we consider that Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization bill, there's going to be some opportunities, both from a funding standpoint and in terms of kind of working the rules of the road to address concerns by the local community. So let's make sure we're aligned on that. In terms of port-related infrastructure, that was a big part of the infrastructure law. And in fact, the Port of Port Angeles won a $8.6 million federal grant through what's called the Port Infrastructure Development Program, which was plussed up very substantially as part of the infrastructure law. And so, that's about jobs. That's about making sure that the port can make investments that it needs to be competitive. So being able to secure that grant, which we did a letter of support for when the port applied, voted for the infrastructure law so that there was more funding to provide, and enabling the port to be able to secure those dollars and make those investments, I think is a big deal. There is also funding in the infrastructure law for rail investments as well, which again is, a critical component to our competitiveness and to addressing some of these supply chain issues. So I guess that was a long way of saying yes. There is funding for those resources.
But in the FAA reauthorization bill, will that include the giant overall picture of new, safer flight management, or is it just reauthorizing the department?
It can. I mean, so I guess when a program is reauthorized, there's an opportunity to take up, reforms and changes to address concerns. And so I guess my invitation is if there's specific concerns that you want the FAA to, where you want the FAA to make changes, or you want us to flag issues that need to be addressed, this is the right time to do that.
Thank you.
You bet.
I noted that, Roy, you had a question or a comment in the chat. Roy, would you like to speak?
Yeah, unmuted. Yes, my name is Roy Morris. I want to thank Derek for his time and his effort to outreach to the community. As always, we enjoy the talks he has on the telephone with his colleagues and the public are much appreciated for input.
Okay.
I lived here for over 36 years at CQ and was principal at Clallam Bay and worked at Nia Bay and worked at Peninsula College and worked at Western. I helped build out some of the $5 million grant we had when they closed in Talco and Georgia Pacific Mills up there.
Mm-hmm.
currently I'm trying to apply some of those job development skills out here on the west end of the Olympic Peninsula with a new president from Peninsula College.
Right.
Quite eager beaver and looking to apply new methods. In the west end, we're looking at a change out from the natural resource extraction economy that is so ingrained in our culture to one more of ecosystem caretaking as a new approach to bring university researchers onto the peninsula to study total ecosystem management models with research laboratories and advanced training for graduate students that would come from universities and use local students to become field techs and laboratory technicians to build a whole new economy. Any wind in the sails for that kind of thinking, or is that too unusual to look at total ecosystem caretaking with research and laboratories and data management?
I mean, I get, I'm not sure, and I'd love to kind of follow up with you and get a better sense of what you're,
Hope to do that.
what you're working on. I will say, you know, the Forest Service, I think, has been charged with not just the mission of driving harvest, but driving some of these broader issues around the total ecosystem. You know, they have to deal with everything related to forest health, combating wildfires and preventing insect infestation and doing things like ecological thinning, you know, for habitat, and trails and roads, and all of these things all kind of fall under the Forest Service's purview. And to your point, they've often struggled with staffing to ensure that they have folks that have those skill sets. So I think that's where we've heard that come up, Roy, is with regard to the staffing of the Forest Service and trying to build some of those capacities into their work. I will mention, you know, we've raised holy hell about the fact that our forest has failed to meet its harvest targets for the last several years, and put language in the appropriations bill saying there needs to be extra attention to this, and there needs to be resources provided to make sure that they start hitting their harvest targets. That is not to say that they shouldn't also do some of the other things under their purview, to the point of your question, but we need to have some reliability and certainty for our milling infrastructure here on the peninsula. But would love to follow up with you. Perhaps Haley from my team can hit you up in the chat, and either she or a member of my team or I can get a little time with you.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
You got it.
Oh. What did I do here? Sorry about that. Let's see, I think I just shared my screen unintentionally. All right. There. Sorry about that. Pressed a button I shouldn't have. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties, pushing buttons I didn't mean to. Yeah, so back to the RECOMPETE Act for a minute there. Are you, from what you understand so far, Representative Kilmer, do you believe that, so I know according to the maps we've seen that from your district, Mason County, Grays Harbor County, Jefferson County, and Clallam County would qualify for this RECOMPETE Act.
Yes.
Based on our prime age employment gap.
Yes.
And, you know, and that makes total sense. I've been talking to Dr. Underwood about it, and we have a lot of retirees that have wealth, but our workforce by and large does not, unless they're lucky and they happen to work for a government agency. And, but these 4 counties are really different in their values, in their infrastructure. You know, you look at Grays Harbor, they have rail, they have natural gas. We have neither in Jefferson or Clallam County. Jefferson is very interested in climate change issues, farming, and small boat, maritime. Port Angeles, Grays Harbor have very different, more industrial kind of flavor and outlook. Will we be able to, and I know we have a better chance of winning if our application group is larger rather than, 2 or 3 different competing applications in our area. And so I'm trying to, work through those things, and where we've got Forks, that area is the most distressed. Certainly Queets is the most distressed area. If we are going to serve their needs with something innovative, it is going to be around, very likely, forestry, value-added timber, innovative products. And there are some great products that could be transformative, but that's not the value or the focus area that, say, Jefferson County would like to see move forward. How would you recommend we reconcile all of this?
It's a great question. I mean, so that'll be dictated by 2 things. One, what the Economic Development Administration considers an eligible applicant, right? They haven't set that yet, right? It may be a city, it may be a county, it may be a consortia of counties, it may be, it could be, an EDA entity like the North Olympic Development Council, which is Clallam and Jefferson, right? So a lot of that's going to be determined by their rulemaking on what determines an eligible applicant. You should think about what you want to communicate in a listening session about what you think an eligible applicant ought to be. I can make a pretty good argument that something like the North Olympic Development Council, because it has an existing economic development strategic plan, may make a lot of sense, right? Even though, to your point, there's different issues in Queets than there is in Port Hadlock or Port Townsend, right? But that may make for an attractive applicant. The other is, what do you want? Right. So it's kind of up to you, right? It's up to the community whether it wants to go in as a partnership, as a group of communities or counties, or whether it wants to go it alone. This is a pilot program, right? And so the hope is that this will be successful, and that the Economic Development Administration will be able to build upon it and do more pilots. And so if a community doesn't secure funding in the first bite at the apple, I think the goal is that this will be successful and there will be more bites at the apple. But we can talk more. I mean, I'm happy to talk offline. And I know I sent you a resource in the chat that I think would be worth talking to just sort of think through that question. I think it's tricky. And as you can imagine, because there are 4 counties that I represent, all of which have need and interest, it's one that I grapple with the same question you are.
Right. I've had lots of conversations about this with our city council members, city managers, and county commissioners. What are you guys thinking? What does this look like? One of the big concerns is, if this is $10 million or $100 million, it really needs to be an organization that has the ability to manage that amount of money successfully, has done single federal audits, has the resources existing and experience to manage huge grant amounts, which, a small nonprofit of 2 or 3 people, that would be a Herculean task for it to be successful. So, we need to get ready. We need to be thinking about these things. This is something that takes a lot of thought and effort for the community to get behind and to say, that, okay, we'll support this. And very likely it's not going to make everyone really happy, but the outcome needs to be successful. That needs to be the bottom line. So 2 last questions. I know you have to jump off at 9. But the first one is a comment. We've started our PTAC program, our Procurement Technical Assistance Center program, which, I think back in 2016, I talked to you about, hey, this is not working well for us. We're not getting any support from this. We need to have our own PTAC. So thank you so much for making it a priority for you and your staff. And the department DLA, DOD changed their rules, and we were able to apply and got funding. And now Rebecca Miller is our PTAC counselor and Apex Accelerator, and we're making a lot of progress there. So that's exciting. Thank you. And that is truly due to your efforts. So thank you.
You got your back.
Yeah. And the next, so there was a question here I noted that is, what is the status of the Wild Olympics? Where are we on that?
Yeah, it hasn't been reintroduced yet in this Congress. It passed out of the House in the last two Congresses and didn't move in the Senate. It passed as part of a broader package focused on protection of environmentally sensitive areas. For folks who haven't followed this, the drive on this has been one to, and this I guess is aligned with the question I got from Roy. The goal here is to protect some of the environmentally sensitive areas that need protection. There's a reason that shellfish growers and folks in our fisheries have been supportive of that proposal because they depend on clean water. There's a reason that a lot of our tourism industry has been supportive of that because where we've designated wilderness areas and wild and scenic rivers around the country, it draws people in their wallets to spend money in a community. When I took office, we did a bunch of listening and tried to address concerns that were raised about the proposal. So the land proposed for designation in the bill as it was introduced in the last Congress pulled out any areas that would be commercially harvested. You can talk to folks within the timber industry, and I think they would acknowledge that this wouldn't have an impact on harvest levels off the Olympic. There were concerns about in the initial form around park expansion. So there's no park expansion in this bill. All Forest Service roads were removed from the proposal because there was concern about that as well. There was concern around potential impact on private property owners. And so there was explicit language that was added to the bill prohibiting any impact on private property owners. And so I think the bill as introduced, and there's a reason that it's gotten broad support from mayors and businesses and tribes throughout the region, is we have the economic upside of addressing some of these issues that matter to tourism, to our shellfish growers, without the downside to the industry. Having said that, we're working on a bunch of stuff related to trying to support and grow the timber industry as well. So I think that was a long way of saying it hasn't passed. We'll likely reintroduce it at some point this year. We've, tried to, I think I just saw in the chat, so the goal is to try to find that balance, to do it in a way that supports the needs of the timber industry and doesn't negatively impact the timber industry. As someone who grew up in Clallam County and who went to work in economic development because of some of the challenges faced by that industry, I have no interest in seeing negative impact to that industry.
Right.
But that also has the economic upside to other industries in our region.
Of all of our private sector industries, the timber industry is by far the highest wage sector. And with the things that are going on with DNR lands and the lack of harvest levels, as you mentioned, at the U.S. Forest Service, it's definitely, the lack of fiber supply is definitely making things difficult for the new business Sustainable Green team out in Forks and Beaver, that they're looking at, up to $100 million of investment. They are very worried about the lack of fiber supply. So, evaluating this and putting things on a pause because they want to see what some of the outcome of that will be. So we're really hoping that we can turn that into a direction that can be a bit more supportive for those really innovative programs where they're doing value-added products, and which of course will help our housing situation, not just in our county and communities, but across the state and elsewhere. So with
and,
that.
and listen, Colleen, so I'm sensitive to that. So there's a reason that the lands that are in the proposal as it exists now are lands that wouldn't be commercially harvested, either because they're not eligible for harvest under the Northwest Forest Plan because they've aged out, or they're just not accessible. And so if you talk to folks in the industry, they'd say, we would never harvest that anyhow. You couldn't put together a timber sale that would get us to access that and to do it in an economical way. And again, having said that, we are working on a bunch of issues with the Forest Service to try to help them meet their harvest targets, not just in the near term, but over the long haul.
Great. That's wonderful news. Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Well, with that, I see it's after 9 o'clock. Thank you very much, Representative Kilmer, for
You
not
bet.
just your time today, but everything you do related to advocacy for our county. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. And to
Thanks,
the employers
everyone.
on the line, thanks for employing people in our community. We appreciate you.
Thank you.